Before anyone knew the name Chernobyl, before it became a warning whispered around the world, there was a quiet town in the dark. It was late April 1986. Most people nearby were asleep. The apartments in Pripyat stood in neat rows beneath a black Ukrainian sky. Children had gone to bed with school books still open on their desks. Kitchen windows glowed faintly. Bicycles rested in stairwells. Laundry hung on balconies. The city looked peaceful, almost perfect, the kind of place built to convince people the future had finally arrived. And then, a little after 1 in the morning, the horizon flashed. Not like lightning, not like a storm. It was a deep, unnatural burst of light. A violent glow from the direction of the nuclear power plant. For a moment, the night itself seemed to split open. People woke up and walked to their windows. Some saw a column of smoke rising into the sky. Some saw a strange blue-white light pulsing above the reactor, a light so beautiful and so wrong that it did not seem to belong to this world. Others heard the blast first. A heavy, distant thud followed by another force that shook glass in its frames. At the plant, men were already running through corridors filled with dust, steam, and confusion. Something had exploded inside reactor number 4. But the first horror of Chernobyl was not the explosion. It was that almost nobody understood what had just happened. The workers who survived the first seconds stepped into a nightmare that made no sense. Concrete had been ripped apart, steel beams twisted like wire. Chunks of graphite, the material from the heart of the reactor, lay scattered across the ground outside like black stones from a volcano. Some men picked them up. They did not know those pieces were deadly. They did not know that invisible energy was passing through their skin, into their blood, into the marrow of their bones. They did not know they were already being changed. Firefighters arrived wearing ordinary gear, the kind used for burning buildings, not for the open core of a destroyed nuclear reactor. They climbed ladders. They dragged hoses. They stepped around glowing debris. They fought flames on a roof that had become one of the most radioactive places on Earth. The fire did not look like a monster. That was the cruel part. There were no fangs, no screaming face in the smoke, no warning sign big enough for the human mind to understand. There was only heat, darkness, broken machinery, and a taste of metal in the mouth. Some of the men began to feel sick within minutes. Their faces reddened as if sunburned. Their hands tingled. Their throats tightened. A few started vomiting. Others kept working because that was what they had been trained to do. The plant was on fire. The city was nearby. Someone had to stop it. Above them, the reactor breathed poison into the night. The air carried radioactive particles over the rooftops, over the roads, over the sleeping families of Pripyat. It drifted into playgrounds, across courtyards, onto baby strollers parked near apartment entrances. It settled on trees and coats and shoes. It landed silently on the skin of people who had no idea they were standing inside history's most famous nuclear disaster. And the next morning, life continued. That may be the most disturbing part. The sun came up. Children went outside. People gathered on a railway bridge to watch the smoke from the plant. Some later called it a bridge of death, though the details around that name are debated. What is certain is that people did stand and watch. They looked toward the burning reactor as if it were a distant factory accident, not an invisible catastrophe, moving through their bodies with every breath. In Pripyat, buses still ran. Shops opened. Weddings were planned. Families discussed weekend routines. Parents pushed children in strollers beneath a sky that had already been contaminated. No sirens told them to run. No official voice told them the truth. The city waited. The world waited. And inside the Soviet system, men in offices began searching for words that could make the impossible sound manageable. An accident, a fire, a situation under control. But Chernobyl was not under control. It was a wound in the machine of the 20th century, and it had torn open at the worst possible place. A nuclear reactor had exploded in a country that believed deeply in secrecy, pride, and the image of perfect progress. The disaster was not only radioactive, it was political, it was human. It was built from pressure, fear, obedience, flawed design, and a chain of decisions that no one wanted to own. This is not a ghost story. No dead hand reached from the darkness and pressed the buttons. No ancient curse slept beneath the concrete. But if horror is the moment when people realize the rules of the world have failed them, then Chernobyl belongs in the darkest corner of history, because the monster was real. It had no shape. It could not be seen. It could pass through walls, clothing, and skin. It could hide inside milk, rainwater, dust, and soil. It could turn a normal spring morning into the beginning of an evacuation that would empty a city for generations. And the people closest to it were told, again and again, that everything was fine. In this story, the haunted house is a power plant. The locked room is reactor number 4. The thing in the basement is a core that should never have been exposed to open air. And the town outside does not know yet that it is already becoming a place people will leave behind. To understand how a city built for the future became a frozen monument to disaster, we have to go back before the explosion, before the sirens, before the hospital beds, before the helicopters and the soldiers and the men sent onto the roof for seconds at a time, because seconds were all their bodies could survive. We have to go back to the world that created Chernobyl, a world that believed it could master nature with concrete, steel, and slogans. A world where nuclear power was not just electricity, but proof of national greatness. A world where mistakes could be more dangerous than radiation, because admitting them was almost unthinkable. And in that world, a young city named Pripyat was glowing with promise. Clean streets, new apartments, good schools, a swimming pool, a movie theater, families who believed they were lucky to live there. Just a few miles away, the reactors stood at the edge of the forest, quiet, massive, waiting. And long before that night sky erupted with unnatural light, the first pieces of the disaster were already being put into place. And long before that night sky erupted with unnatural light, the first pieces of the disaster were already being put into place. They were not put there by one evil man. They were not placed in a single terrible hour. They were built slowly year after year, under fluorescent lights, behind office doors, across factory floors, inside meeting rooms where the future was discussed like a thing that could be forced into existence. The Soviet Union wanted power. Not just electrical power, it wanted the kind of power that could be photographed, measured, broadcast, printed on posters, taught to children. It wanted dams, rockets, reactors, and cities that rose out of nowhere as proof that history itself was moving in the right direction. By the 1970s, nuclear energy carried a special kind of promise. It was not coal smoke darkening the air. It was not oil pulled from the ground. It was the atom, clean, modern, scientific, almost magical. A nuclear power station could turn a quiet stretch of land into a symbol of national confidence. It could power homes, factories, schools, and whole regions. It could make leaders feel as though they were standing at the edge of tomorrow, looking down on everyone still trapped in yesterday. So near the Pripyat River in northern Ukraine, the Soviet state began building the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. The name Chernobyl came from an older town nearby, but the true showpiece was not the old town. It was Pripyat. Pripyat was founded in 1970. It was built to house the workers of the nuclear plant and their families. It was a young city in every sense. Young buildings, young parents, young engineers, young children playing between concrete apartment blocks under the shadow of a future their parents had been promised was safe. The average age was low, the mood was proud, people wanted to live there. That matters, because today, when we hear the name Pripyat, we imagine empty streets, abandoned classrooms, dolls left on dusty beds, amusement rides rusting beneath gray skies. We imagine silence. We imagine the dead city. But before the disaster, Pripyat was alive. It had music coming from apartment windows. It had grocery lines and school lessons and evening walks. It had workers returning home tired from long shifts. It had mothers calling children in before dark. It had neighbors who knew each other by name. It had movie nights, sports clubs, wedding photos, and families saving money for better furniture. It was not a horror set. It was home. That is what makes the story heavier. The people living there were not characters waiting for tragedy. They were ordinary people inside an extraordinary system. They trusted the world around them because trust was part of daily life. The power plant was not some distant threat. It was the reason the city existed. It paid salaries. It gave status. It gave young families a place in the Soviet dream. From many balconies, the plant could be seen in the distance. Its stacks and blocks sat beyond the trees like a sleeping machine, and every day buses carried workers toward it. The Chernobyl plant used a type of reactor known as RBMK. It was a Soviet design. It was large. It was powerful. It could produce enormous amounts of electricity. It also had design features that, under certain conditions, could make it unstable. Those words sound dry. Design features. Certain conditions. Unstable. But history sometimes hides its monsters inside boring language. At the time, the danger was not understood by everyone who needed to understand it. Some problems were known inside technical circles. Some were minimized. Some were buried under confidence, bureaucracy, and the belief that a well-run Soviet facility would never allow the wrong conditions to happen. A reactor was supposed to be controlled. The operators had procedures. The engineers had training. The managers had reports. The state had pride. And pride can become its own kind of blindness. Around Chernobyl, life continued in the rhythm of a planned world. The plant grew in stages. Reactor number 1 began operating in the late 1970s. Then came number 2. Then number 3. Then number 4, the reactor that would one day become the center of the story. More units were planned. The future was expanding. In Pripyat, people saw construction cranes and concrete and believed they were watching progress. A new amusement park was being prepared. There were plans for celebrations. The city was still unfinished, still growing, still becoming what it was meant to be. That is one of the cruel details of Chernobyl. It did not destroy a dying place. It interrupted a dream mid-sentence. The roads were clean. The buildings were new. The schools were full. The hospital was active. The Palace of Culture had performances and public events. The swimming pool, the sports facilities, the cafes, the shops, all of it carried the ordinary warmth of people building lives. And just beyond that life, the plant operated day and night. Inside the reactor halls, everything depended on discipline. A nuclear power plant is not loud in the way people imagine. It does not always roar like a monster. Much of its danger is hidden behind panels, gauges, pipes, valves, and numbers moving across instruments. The work can feel routine. That is part of the risk. When something powerful becomes familiar, people begin to live beside it, as if familiarity were the same as safety. The men who worked there were not fools. Many were educated. Many were skilled. Many were proud of their work. They believed they were serving their country. They believed they were helping build a better future. Some knew the plant had issues. Some trusted that those issues were manageable. Some knew only what they had been told. And in the Soviet system, what a person was told could matter more than what a person suspected. The culture around major projects did not encourage open fear. It rewarded confidence. It rewarded meeting deadlines. It rewarded saying the plan was working, even when reality was more complicated. A small problem could become a report. A report could become a discussion. A discussion could become a delay. A delay could become embarrassment. An embarrassment in a system built on the image of strength could feel dangerous. So the machine kept moving. Concrete was poured. Turbines spun. Shifts changed. Control rooms glowed at night. In Pripyat, children slept beneath blankets, while their parents worked behind security fences. Families learned to ignore the plant the way people in coastal towns learned to ignore the sea. It was always there. It shaped everything. It provided everything. And because it had always been there, people stopped imagining what it could take away. But the sea can look calm before it rises. A forest can stand silent before it burns. A machine can hum smoothly while a flaw waits inside it. By 1986, Chernobyl was part of everyday life. Reactor number 4 had been operating for only a few years. It was not ancient, it was not visibly broken, it was not a ruin waiting to collapse. It was modern enough to inspire confidence, powerful enough to matter, complicated enough to hide danger, and surrounded by people who had been taught to believe that the future was something they could command. That was the world before everything went wrong. A world of clean streets and quiet apartments. A world of engineers, families, officials, and workers. A world where the most dangerous thing was not always the reactor itself, but the silence around its weaknesses. Because before the explosion, before the firemen climbed onto the roof, before Pripyat became a name people spoke with a chill in their voice, there were people standing close to the machine. People with jobs, fears, ambitions, orders, and secrets. And to understand why the night of April 26th unfolded the way it did, we have to step closer to them. And to understand why the night of April 26th unfolded the way it did, we have to step closer to them. Not to turn them into villains, not to make them into symbols, but to remember that disasters are not built by machines alone. They are built by people making decisions under pressure. People following orders. People trying to do their jobs. People trapped inside systems larger than themselves. At Chernobyl, the people involved were not standing outside history, watching it approach. They were already inside it. There were the plant workers, the engineers, the operators, the technicians, and the shift supervisors. They moved through the corridors of the power station every day, as if the building were an ordinary workplace. They knew which doors stuck. They knew which hallways echoed. They knew the sound of the turbines, the pattern of the shifts, the quiet language of gauges and alarms. To an outsider, a control room might look like a wall of blinking lights and unreadable instruments. To an operator, it was a living map. Every switch meant something. Every needle had a normal range. Every sound carried information. The men inside those rooms were responsible for keeping something enormous under control. A reactor is not simply turned on and forgotten. It must be watched, adjusted, balanced. The energy inside it is invisible, but the responsibility is not. Among the people tied to that night was Anatoly Dyatlov, the deputy chief engineer at the plant. His name would later become one of the most controversial names in the entire disaster. Some accounts describe him as harsh, demanding, and difficult to challenge. Others argue that he became a convenient target after the explosion, a man blamed for failures that reached far beyond one control room. What is certain is that Dyatlov was there that night, and he had authority. In a place like Chernobyl, authority mattered. It shaped the air in the room. It determined which concerns were spoken clearly, and which ones stayed trapped behind a person's teeth. In dangerous systems, silence can become a physical force. It can press down on people until warning signs look smaller than they really are. There was also Alexander Akimov, the shift supervisor for reactor number 4. Akimov was not supposed to become a tragic figure in world history. He was a working man with a role to perform. That night, he was responsible for the operators on shift. He had procedures to follow, equipment to monitor, and decisions to make. After the explosion, witnesses remembered him trying to understand what had happened. Like others, he did not immediately believe the reactor core had been destroyed. The idea was too enormous, too impossible. The instruments were confusing, the building was damaged, information came in pieces, and human beings do not always accept the worst truth first. Sometimes the mind circles around it. Sometimes it reaches for a smaller disaster, because the real one is too large to hold. Another key operator was Leonid Toptunov. He was young. He was in his mid-20s. He was responsible for controlling the reactor's power during the test that night. Later, his name would be tied to some of the most important moments before the explosion. It is easy, from a distance, to look at a disaster and imagine that everyone should have known exactly what to do. But inside the room, there was pressure, there was hierarchy, there was fatigue, there was confusion. There was the heavy knowledge that the plant had goals, schedules, and expectations, and there was a test waiting to be completed. The test itself was not supposed to be dramatic. It was not an experiment designed by reckless men in search of danger. In simple terms, the plant wanted to know whether a turbine, as it slowed down after losing power, could still generate enough electricity for a short time to keep certain safety systems running before backup generators fully came online. That sounds technical. It sounds almost boring. But again, history hides its terror in ordinary phrases. A safety test, a routine procedure, a delayed schedule, a reactor at low power. Those words do not sound like the beginning of a nightmare, but they were. The test had been attempted before and had not produced the desired results. So it remained unfinished, waiting to be done properly. On April 25, 1986, reactor number 4 was scheduled for shutdown and maintenance. That created a chance to run the test. People came to work expecting a difficult shift, maybe a long one, but not the end of a city. Outside the plant, Pripyat lived its normal life. Inside apartments, families prepared dinner. Children came home from school. Workers changed clothes before leaving for their shifts. The future still looked stable. The windows still reflected the evening light. No one walking under those apartment blocks could have known that decisions inside the plant would soon reach into every kitchen, every classroom, every bedroom. There were also the managers and officials. Some worked at the plant. Some were part of the Soviet energy system. Some were far away from the control room, but their influence was still present. They lived in the rules, the deadlines, the reporting structures, and the culture of obedience. A disaster like Chernobyl is never just one person pressing one button. It is a chain. One link is design. One link is training. One link is communication. One link is pressure. One link is pride. One link is fear. And when enough weak links line up, the chain does not look broken until it is already tearing apart. The reactor itself was another character in this story, though not a human one. Reactor number 4 was massive. It was powerful. It was built around a design that could behave in dangerous ways under certain conditions. Some of those dangers were not clearly communicated to the operators. Some were not fully appreciated. And some were hidden behind the belief that no properly managed reactor would ever be pushed into that state. That belief mattered, because people often build safety around what they think will happen. But disasters are born in the space between what people expect and what reality allows. The people in the control room did not see themselves as walking into a haunted chamber. They were at work. They were tired. They were focused on completing a task. They were surrounded by systems that were supposed to protect them. That may be the most frightening part. The horror did not begin with panic. It began with routine. It began with a scheduled test. It began with men looking at instruments, following instructions, and trying to bring a reactor through a procedure that had been planned in advance. Some would later say mistakes were made by the operators. Others would point to the reactor design, to management, to secrecy, to the Soviet system itself. The truth is not clean. It does not fit neatly into one name or one moment. History rarely does. But when we step into that control room, we should not imagine monsters. We should imagine men under bright lights, in the deep hours of the night, facing a machine they believed they understood. We should imagine the tension of a workplace where authority could feel heavier than doubt. We should imagine a young operator watching power levels fall in ways that made the situation harder to manage. We should imagine a supervisor caught between procedure, uncertainty, and the pressure to keep moving. We should imagine a senior engineer determined to finish a test that had already been delayed. And outside, beyond the walls of the plant, we should imagine Pripyat, still awake in small places, still asleep in others, still breathing the calm air of an ordinary night. The people involved were not only the ones in the control room, they were also the firefighters waiting at their station, unaware that soon they would be called to a fire no training had prepared them for. They were the doctors and nurses who would receive men with symptoms they did not fully understand. They were the bus drivers who would later carry families away from home. They were the children who would wake up the next morning and ask why adults looked worried. They were the officials who would have to choose between telling the truth quickly or protecting the image of control. And somewhere inside all of this, the first warning signs were already beginning to appear, not as screams, not as alarms loud enough to wake a city, but as small failures, delays, numbers that did not behave, conditions that drifted out of the safe and familiar, the kind of warnings that history often gives before a catastrophe, quiet ones, easy to explain away, easy to ignore, until the machine finally answers. But before it did, it whispered. That is how many disasters begin. Not with one clean warning, not with a single red light that tells everyone to stop. They begin with small things that seem manageable. A delay, a number sliding too low, a procedure that no longer fits the conditions in front of it. A room full of people who sense that something is wrong, but not wrong enough to bring the whole world to a halt. On April 25, 1986, reactor number 4 was scheduled to shut down for maintenance. That shutdown created the opportunity for the safety test. The idea was to reduce the reactor's power, disconnect the turbine, and measure whether the spinning turbine could still produce enough electricity for a short time while backup diesel generators started up. On paper, it was controlled. On paper, it had steps. On paper, the reactor would be brought down to a low but stable power level, the test would be performed, data would be collected, and the plant would move on. But paper does not sweat. Paper does not get tired. Paper does not sit inside a control room after midnight with a nuclear reactor behaving in ways that make every decision heavier than the last. The first warning sign was time. The test was supposed to happen earlier. During the day shift, reactor number 4 began reducing power. The operators moved toward the planned conditions. Everything was being arranged. Then the grid controllers asked the plant to keep producing electricity longer than expected. Demand on the electrical grid was high. The power was still needed, so the reactor stayed at partial power for hours. It sounds simple, just a delay. But in a nuclear reactor, time is not empty. Conditions change. The state of the reactor changes. The people change too. The day shift that had prepared for the test did not end up carrying it out. The evening shift inherited a situation already in progress. Then the night shift came in later, closer to midnight. By then, the test had been delayed for hours. The reactor had been sitting in an unusual state. The original rhythm was gone. That was one of the first quiet movements toward disaster. Not dramatic, not cinematic. Just a schedule slipping out of place. When the night shift took over, they were not walking into a normal beginning. They were stepping into the middle of something complicated, something already delayed, something that still had to be completed. There is a special kind of danger in inherited work. The person who begins a task understands its shape. The person who receives it later may only see the remaining steps. Details can blur. Assumptions can pass from one shift to another like shadows. Everyone thinks someone else understood the full picture. And all the while, the reactor waits. As the power reduction continued, another warning sign appeared. The reactor power fell too low. It dropped far below the intended level for the test. This mattered because a reactor at very low power can become difficult to control, especially under the conditions that were forming inside reactor number 4. A buildup of xenon, a substance that absorbs neutrons, had made the reactor sluggish. It was like trying to guide a massive animal that no longer responded the way it should. The operators needed to raise power again. To do that, they withdrew control rods. Control rods are supposed to help manage the nuclear reaction. Inserted into the core, they slow it down. Withdrawn, they allow the reaction to increase. Again, the words sound calm. Withdraw rods. Raise power. Stabilize the reactor. But each action was moving the plant closer to a condition where the reactor was harder to predict. The margin of safety was shrinking, not all at once. Not in a way that shouted. It shrank like the walls of a room moving inward, while the people inside convinced themselves they still had space. The instruments gave numbers. The people interpreted them. The system continued. In the control room, there would have been no music, no storm outside, no supernatural sign that history was opening beneath their feet. There were men at panels, voices, instructions, the hum of equipment, the exhausting brightness of artificial light in the middle of the night. The warning signs were technical, but the danger was human. The reactor was not simply unstable because of physics. It was becoming unstable inside a culture that made stopping difficult. To stop would mean admitting the test could not continue as planned. To stop would mean delay, reports. Questions, possibly blame. It would mean telling superiors that the conditions were no longer right, that the procedure should be abandoned. In a perfect safety culture, that decision should be easy. In the real world, especially in a system built on hierarchy and pressure, it can feel almost impossible. So the night moved forward. The reactor was brought up to a low power level, lower than originally intended. It was not the clean setup described in the plan. It was a compromised state, a dangerous middle ground, enough power to continue, not enough comfort to feel safe. More warning signs followed. Safety systems were disabled or bypassed as part of the test conditions. This was not necessarily done with the intention of creating danger. In the minds of those carrying out the procedure, these steps were connected to the test they had been told to perform. But a machine does not care why a protection is removed. It only knows that the protection is gone. Emergency cooling systems were turned off. Automatic shutdown signals were blocked. The turbine trip protections were disabled so the test could proceed without the reactor shutting itself down too early. Each change may have had a procedural explanation. Together, they formed something darker. They made the reactor more exposed. A safety system is often invisible until it is needed. People can grow impatient with protections because most of the time, nothing happens. The lock feels unnecessary until the door is being forced open. The alarm feels annoying until smoke fills the hallway. Inside reactor number 4, the locks were being unlatched, one by one. And still, the night did not stop. The reactor's behavior became more dangerous as the test approached. Water flow increased. Steam conditions shifted. The design of the RBMK reactor meant that under some circumstances, changes in steam inside the core could increase reactivity instead of reducing it. This was connected to what is known as a positive void coefficient. For a narrator, those words are cold. For a reactor, they are terrifying. It means that in the wrong conditions, the machine could respond to a loss of cooling water in a way that made the reaction grow stronger. More heat, more steam, more reactivity, a loop that could begin feeding itself. The operators were not fully prepared for how violently this could unfold. And they were not clearly warned about one of the cruelest details in the design. The control rods, the very things meant to stop the reaction, had graphite tips. Under certain conditions, when the rods were first inserted, they could briefly increase reactivity before reducing it. The stop button had a shadow inside it. That is not a metaphor. That was physics, and it was waiting in the core. By the final minutes before the test, reactor number 4 was no longer in an ordinary state. It was low on power. It had many control rods withdrawn. Safety systems had been disabled. The reactor was unstable in ways that were not fully visible to the men in the room. Yet the instruments still existed. The panels still glowed. The procedure still seemed possible. That is how history traps people. It does not always look like doom from the inside. Sometimes it looks like one more step, one more instruction, one more chance to finish what was started. Outside the plant, Pripyat remained calm. The city lights rested in the darkness. Families slept. No one stood in the streets waiting for the future to break. No one knew that a reactor a few miles away had entered a state so dangerous that the smallest movement could become irreversible. The first warning signs had come. Time had slipped. Power had fallen. Control rods had been withdrawn. Protections had been removed. The reactor had become difficult. But warning signs are only useful when people are willing to stop. And inside that control room, with the test still unfinished and authority pressing down like a ceiling, the most important mistake was still ahead. A mistake so simple in appearance that it would later haunt every explanation of Chernobyl. Because soon, someone would press a button meant to save the reactor, and instead, the machine would begin to tear itself apart. Because soon, someone would press a button meant to save the reactor, and instead, the machine would begin to tear itself apart. That is the part of Chernobyl that still feels impossible. Not because a button was pressed, not because a machine failed, but because the final action before the explosion was not an act of destruction. It was not someone trying to unleash power. It was not someone opening a forbidden door just to see what was behind it. It was an emergency shutdown, a safety command, a last move that should have made the reactor quiet. The button was known as AZ5. In simple terms, it was meant to insert the control rods into the core and shut down the nuclear reaction. It was the kind of button people imagine as the final answer, the thing you press when you need the machine to stop, and that is what makes it so haunting. The stop command became part of the disaster. By the time that button was pressed, reactor number 4 had been pushed into a dangerous condition. The power had dropped too low earlier in the night. To recover it, many control rods had been withdrawn from the core. The reactor was operating at a low power level, in a state where it was difficult to control and deeply vulnerable to sudden changes. The test moved forward anyway. The turbine was disconnected from steam. The experiment began. Water flow and steam conditions started shifting. Inside the core, the balance was changing. The reactor was not calm. It was waiting at the edge of something the operators could not fully see. In the control room, the men saw instruments. They saw numbers. They heard instructions. They watched the test unfold in seconds that must have felt ordinary until they no longer did. Then came the moment. Someone pressed AZ5. The control rods began to descend. For most reactors, for most people listening now, that sounds like the end of the danger. Rods go in. Reaction slows. The machine settles down. But reactor number 4 was not in a normal state, and the control rods were not built in a way that made them harmless at the first instant of insertion. They had graphite displacers at their tips. Under the wrong conditions, as those graphite sections entered the lower part of the core, they could increase reactivity for a brief moment before the rod's absorbing material did its job. A brief moment. That phrase is almost too small for what happened. Because in a reactor already unstable, already starved of margin, already surrounded by disabled protections and human pressure, a brief moment was enough. Power began to surge, not slowly, not in a way that gave everyone time to think. The reaction spiked with terrifying speed. The core heated violently, steam formed, pressure rose. The water channels could not hold. The reactor was no longer being managed by men in a control room. It was becoming a force. There are arguments and technical debates about the exact sequence of those final seconds. That is the nature of disasters this complex. But the broad shape is clear enough to be chilling. The reactor power rose far beyond what it should have been. The fuel channels ruptured. Steam pressure built inside the core. The enormous upper biological shield, a massive structure weighing hundreds of tons, was lifted and displaced. Then came explosions. The first blast was likely a steam explosion. The second may have involved additional reactions, including hydrogen or other explosive forces. The exact details have been studied for decades and are still discussed. But to the men inside the plant, those distinctions did not matter. The building shook. The lights flickered. Concrete cracked. Metal screamed. The reactor was open. That is the sentence that should stop the heart. The reactor was open. A nuclear reactor core, which was supposed to remain sealed, shielded, cooled, and controlled, had been blown apart and exposed to the night air. The plant was no longer a power station in trouble. It was a wound in the earth. In the control room, the men did not fully understand it at first. How could they? The idea was too large. It violated everything they believed about the plant, about the reactor, about the limits of what could happen. A reactor does not simply explode. A core does not simply vanish into open air. The mind rejects a truth that big. It tries to translate it into something smaller. A ruptured tank, a broken pipe, a fire in the turbine hall, an accident that could still be contained. That was the mistake nobody wanted to admit. Not only before the explosion, but after it. The core was gone. And almost no one could say it. Reports came in that made no sense. Radiation meters showed levels that seemed impossible. Some instruments went off scale, meaning they could not even measure the true level. Other meters only read up to a limited amount, and those readings created a false sense that the disaster was smaller than it was. Men were sent to look. Some saw graphite on the ground, graphite from the core. That should have been proof. But proof is only powerful when people are ready to accept it. Inside the chain of command, the conclusion was resisted. Operators and officials did not want to believe that the reactor had been destroyed. To admit it would mean entering a reality for which there was no normal procedure. It would mean acknowledging that the plant itself had become a source of invisible mass poisoning. It would mean telling a nearby city that the air was dangerous, that children sleeping in apartment blocks were downwind of an open reactor. So the mind reached for denial. The reactor is intact. The core is still there. Water must be supplied. The fire must be controlled. The situation is serious, but manageable. These ideas moved through the first hours like ghosts, not because every person was lying. Some were confused, some were afraid, some trusted the instruments they had. Some were repeating what superiors believed. Some were trapped by the simple human need for the world to still make sense. But reality does not wait for belief. Radiation was pouring out. Pieces of nuclear fuel and graphite lay exposed around the destroyed unit. Fires burned in different parts of the building. The graphite itself burned, helping carry radioactive material upward into the atmosphere. The plume began spreading beyond the plant, beyond the town, beyond the borders of what officials could control. And still, orders were given as if the reactor could be saved. Water was pumped toward a core that was no longer where people needed it to be. Workers were sent into lethal areas because the scale of the danger was not acknowledged. Men walked through corridors where the air itself was becoming an enemy. Some workers saw things no human being should ever see in a power plant. The ceiling gone, the stars visible through torn concrete, chunks of black graphite on the ground, fires glowing in places that should have been sealed. A ruined industrial landscape lit by an invisible force that was already entering their bodies. A few understood. Some later tried to warn others. But warning, in those first hours, moved slowly. Radiation moved faster. This is where Chernobyl becomes more than an accident. It becomes a tragedy of recognition, a disaster made worse because the truth arrived before people were willing to speak it. The mistake was not only pressing ahead with the test. It was not only withdrawing too many control rods. It was not only disabling safety systems. It was not only the design flaw hidden inside the emergency shutdown. It was the refusal, in the first terrible hours, to accept what the evidence was screaming. The reactor had exploded. The core was exposed. The city was in danger. And every minute spent denying that truth gave the disaster more time to breathe. At the plant, men continued working. Some stayed at their posts, some searched for missing colleagues, some tried to restore water flow. Some moved through darkness and steam, stepping over debris that could deliver a deadly dose in moments. Their courage was real, their suffering was real, but courage cannot make radiation safe, and duty cannot protect a body from particles it cannot see. The mistake nobody wanted to admit had already happened. The machine had entered a state no one could command. The emergency shutdown had become a trigger. The reactor had blown itself open. Yet in Pripyat, just a few miles away, most people still did not know. The city slept under a poisoned sky. Mothers rested beside children. Apartments stayed warm. Streetlights burned softly over empty roads. The new amusement park waited for a celebration that would never happen. And at the edge of the forest, reactor number 4 glowed and burned like something that should not exist. The first warning signs had been ignored. The final safety command had failed. The truth had become too horrifying to accept. But the disaster was not finished. It had only crossed the line from mistake into escalation. Because once the reactor was opened to the air, Chernobyl stopped being a crisis inside a building. It became a spreading darkness. And everyone nearby was already inside it. And everyone nearby was already inside it. That is what escalation means in a disaster like Chernobyl. It is not one moment. It is not the explosion alone. It is the spreading of consequences faster than understanding can follow. It is the gap between what is happening and what people are willing to say out loud. It is a clock beginning to run while the people responsible for the clock insist there is still time. In the first hours after the explosion, reactor number 4 was burning. The fire sent radioactive material into the air, not in one clean burst, but in a continuing release. Destroyed core had become an open source of contamination. Smoke and dust rose into the night. Winds carried invisible particles beyond the walls of the plant, beyond the security fences, beyond anything a guard or a gate could stop. The power station was no longer just damaged. It was contaminating the world around it. Firefighters from Pripyat and nearby areas came quickly. Many of them had no idea what they were facing. To them, it was a fire at an industrial facility. A serious fire, yes. A dangerous fire, yes. But still a fire. They were trained to fight flames. They were not trained to stand beside an exposed reactor core. They wore helmets, boots, coats, and gloves. Ordinary protection for an extraordinary nightmare. They climbed onto roofs. They moved hoses into position. They worked close to debris from the reactor. Some stepped over fragments of graphite, without knowing that those black chunks could deliver a dangerous dose of radiation in a short time. There is a terrible kind of innocence in that image. A man doing his job, a boot landing near a piece of the reactor core, a hand grabbing equipment. A face lit by fire, a body being harmed by something it cannot feel at first. Radiation does not always announce itself with pain. That is one of the reasons it frightens people so deeply. It can enter quietly. It can damage cells before the person understands anything is wrong. It can feel like heat, nausea, a strange taste, weakness. Or at first it can feel like nothing. The firefighters kept working. Some began to vomit. Some felt dizzy. Some developed burns that were not normal burns. But the flames had to be fought. If the fires spread to other parts of the plant, the disaster could become even worse. There were other reactors nearby. There were turbine halls, electrical systems, fuel, machinery, and structures that had to be protected. So the men stayed. That is one of the hardest truths in the story. Some of the people who suffered most in the early hours were also the people who prevented the disaster from becoming even larger. Their actions mattered. Their bravery mattered. But they were sent into conditions they did not fully understand because the truth had not caught up with the orders. Inside the plant, workers were trying to make sense of a broken world. Some areas were dark. Some were filled with steam. Some were flooded. Some were littered with debris. The layout itself had become hostile. Corridors that had once been familiar were now changed by the blast. Doors were jammed. Walls were damaged. The normal routes of work became passages through a poisoned maze. Men searched for colleagues. Some tried to reach valves. Some tried to restore cooling water. Some tried to report what they had seen. But the information moved upward through layers of disbelief. A worker could say there was graphite outside. A meter could scream that radiation was far beyond normal. A man could return sick and shaken. Still, the official conclusion could remain smaller than reality. The reactor is damaged. The reactor is not destroyed. The fire is being handled. The situation is under control. Those words are frightening because they are not only lies. Sometimes they are hope wearing the mask of fact. By morning, the plant grounds were contaminated. People were getting sick. Fires had been fought. Some were under control. But the core continued to release radioactive material. The invisible part of the disaster had barely begun, and Pripyat woke up. Imagine that city in the morning, not as a ruin, not as an abandoned place, as a living city filled with people who had no reason to believe their lives had just changed forever. A spring morning arrived. The temperature was mild. The streets looked normal. The apartment blocks looked normal. The shops, buses, sidewalks, schools, and courtyards were still there. The ordinary world had not changed its shape. That is why invisible danger is so cruel. If a city is burning, people run. If floodwater fills the streets, people climb. If bombs are falling, people hide. But if radiation settles quietly on the ground, a mother may open a window for fresh air. A child may step outside to play. A man may walk to work. A family may stand on a balcony and look toward the smoke. The body has no instinct for this kind of threat. There were rumors, of course. People had heard something. Some had seen the glow in the night. Some had heard the explosion. Some knew there had been a fire at the plant, but rumor is not the same as warning. A warning tells you what to do. A rumor only makes the air feel strange. Pripyat did not receive an immediate evacuation order. People were not told the full danger in those early hours. That delay remains one of the most haunting parts of Chernobyl. The city was close enough to the disaster to be at risk, but life continued while officials debated, measured, argued, and reported. Children went outside. People stood in lines. Couples walked. Windows remained open. Laundry hung in the radioactive air. At the hospital, the first victims arrived. Firefighters and plant workers were brought in with symptoms that confused and frightened medical staff. Some had nausea and vomiting. Some had burns. Some seemed weak in ways that did not match ordinary injuries. Their clothing and bodies carried contamination into the building. Doctors and nurses tried to help them. Many were brave. Many were not fully protected. The hospital itself became part of the contaminated landscape. Clothing was removed. Patients were washed. The injured were treated as well as local staff could manage. But acute radiation sickness is not like a broken bone or a normal burn. It is damage happening at the deepest level of the body. And for some of the men, the first symptoms were only the beginning. Beyond Pripyat, the Soviet authorities began to understand that the situation was much larger than a fire. Radiation readings were too high. Reports from the site were too severe. Specialists were brought in. Military units would soon be involved. Helicopters would be used to drop materials onto the burning reactor. Lead, sand, clay, boron, and other substances would be thrown into the open wound in an attempt to smother it and reduce the release. But those actions came with danger too. Helicopter crews flew over a reactor that was still emitting intense radiation. The air above the plant was dangerous. The pilots looked down into a ruin that no human being was meant to hover above. They had to approach again and again, carrying loads over the exposed core, trying to hit a target that was both industrial wreckage and radioactive hell. From a distance, it may have looked like a military operation. Up close, it was men flying over a wound in the world. On the ground, soldiers and specialists began entering a zone that was changing hour by hour. Roads were measured. Soil was measured. Buildings were measured. Vehicles became contaminated. Boots carried particles. Dust became dangerous. Radiation made geography unstable. One place could be survivable for a short time. Another place nearby could be deadly. A patch of ground could look normal and still hold a dose no person should receive. The world had become uneven in a way the eye could not read. That is why the escalation felt so unreal. Everything looked too ordinary. The trees still stood. The river still moved. The city still had walls and windows and staircases. But the meaning of everything had changed. A coat was no longer just a coat. It could carry contamination. Milk was no longer just milk. It could carry radioactive iodine. Rain was no longer just rain. It could bring particles down from the sky. Dust was no longer just dust. The familiar world had become suspect. Inside government channels, information was moving outward, but slowly and carefully. The Soviet system was not built for instant openness. It was built to control messages, protect authority, and avoid panic. Officials feared chaos. They feared embarrassment. They feared admitting a failure at a flagship nuclear site. But radiation did not respect borders. It did not wait for permission, it moved with the weather. In time, radiation would be detected outside the Soviet Union, including in Sweden. That outside detection would help force the truth into the open. But in the earliest phase, the people closest to the disaster still knew less than people farther away would soon discover through instruments. That is one of the darkest ironies. A radioactive cloud can tell the truth before a government does. While officials struggled to define the scale of the emergency, Pripyat remained in place. The city had become a waiting room. People were told to stay calm. Some were told an evacuation might be temporary. They were not immediately told that their homes, their clothes, their books, their photographs, their children's toys, and the streets they knew might soon become part of an exclusion zone. Imagine being asked to leave for a few days. Imagine closing your door behind you, thinking you will return. Imagine not knowing that the life inside that apartment is already ending, but even that moment had not fully arrived yet. Before the buses, before the announcements, before families stood with small bags, trying to decide what mattered enough to carry. Before Pripyat became a city of open windows and unfinished meals, the disaster had to climb toward its darkest moment. The explosion had happened. The fire had burned. The first responders had been exposed. The city had breathed the contaminated air. The authorities had delayed. The invisible poison had spread. And now the people of Pripyat were about to be told to leave. Not forever. That would have been too honest. They would be told it was temporary. They would be told to take only what they needed. They would be told the buses would bring them back. And for many of them, that was the last lie their hometown ever heard. And for many of them, that was the last lie their hometown ever heard. The evacuation of Pripyat began on April 27, 1986. By then, the city had been waiting for more than a day. More than a day after the explosion. More than a day after the reactor was torn open. More than a day after radioactive material began moving through the air, settling onto streets, drifting into apartments, touching the hands and faces of people who were still living as if the world had not changed. When the announcement finally came, it did not sound like the end of a city. It was calm, controlled, official. Residents were told that because of an unfavorable radiation situation, the city would be evacuated. They were told to gather documents, essential belongings, and some food. They were told to shut off appliances, close windows, and remain calm. And most importantly, they were told the evacuation would last only a few days. That detail matters. A few days, not forever, not the rest of your life. Not long enough for your apartment to become a time capsule. Not long enough for weeds to grow through playgrounds, for trees to swallow sidewalks, for your school desk to gather decades of dust. A few days, so people packed lightly. They left behind furniture, family photographs, toys, books, clothing, letters, pets, houseplants, dishes still in cupboards, food still on tables, and the ordinary objects that make a home feel like a home, because why carry everything if you are coming back? Outside, buses began arriving in long lines. Hundreds of them. They came to take people away from the city that had been built for the future. The same roads that once carried workers to the nuclear plant now carried families out of a place they did not yet know they were losing. People stood near apartment blocks with bags in their hands. Children stayed close to their parents. Neighbors asked questions no one could answer. How long will this take? Where are we going? What about the animals? What about school? What about work? What about the things we left behind? There were answers, but not the whole truth. The evacuation had the shape of order, but beneath that order was dread. Soldiers, officials, and police guided the process. People boarded buses. The doors closed. Engines started. One by one, the vehicles pulled away. From the windows, residents could see their city passing beside them. The apartment buildings, the courtyards, the shops, the streets where they had walked the day before, the places where their lives had seemed permanent. They were close enough to see everything. And still, they could not understand what they were leaving. That is one of the darkest moments of Chernobyl. Not the blast, not the fire, but the quiet departure of a whole city under a lie gentle enough to be believed. A man might have left his favorite jacket hanging behind the door. A child might have left a doll on a bed. A woman might have left bread on the kitchen table. Someone might have locked an apartment carefully, thinking it was the responsible thing to do. Keys turned in doors that would not open for them again. The buses moved away from Pripyat, carrying people into uncertainty. Behind them, the city remained. It did not collapse. It did not burn to the ground. It simply emptied. A living city became a silent city, and silence in Chernobyl was never empty. It was contaminated. As Pripyat was evacuated, the disaster continued at the plant. The destroyed reactors still had to be contained. The radioactive release had to be reduced. The fire had to be suppressed. The surrounding area had to be measured, controlled, and sealed off. The Soviet state began mobilizing an enormous response, pulling in soldiers, engineers, miners, pilots, doctors, scientists, and workers from across the region and beyond. Many of them would become known as liquidators. It is a cold word, liquidators. It sounds administrative, almost clean. But it referred to the people sent to liquidate the consequences of the accident, to remove debris, wash buildings, bury contaminated soil, cut down forests, build barriers, hunt contaminated animals, dig tunnels, measure radiation, decontaminate roads, construct the structure that would eventually cover the ruined reactor. They entered a landscape where the rules of normal life had been rewritten. The ground could be dangerous. A roof could be deadly. A vehicle could become radioactive simply by being there. One of the most feared places was the roof of reactor number 3, near the destroyed reactor number 4. It was covered with radioactive debris blown there by the explosion. Pieces of graphite and fuel had landed on the roof like fragments of a forbidden fire. Machines were supposed to help remove it. Robots were sent in. Some failed. The radiation was too intense. Electronics broke down. Equipment that should have protected human beings could not survive the environment long enough to do the job. So human beings were sent instead. Men were dressed in heavy protective gear, but the protection was limited. Some wore lead sheets, some had masks, some carried shovels. They were given only seconds to work, not minutes, seconds. They would run onto the roof, shovel radioactive debris over the edge, and run back, again and again. Each man a brief visitor to a place no body was meant to endure. From the outside, it might look almost absurd. A man runs across a roof, throws something, and disappears. But inside those seconds, history was pressing against his skin. The radiation levels were so high that time itself became a weapon. The difference between survival and severe exposure could be measured in moments. Some of these men were called biorobots. Because machines could not do it, so bodies did. That phrase is difficult to hear. It should be. A human being should never be reduced to a replacement for broken machinery. Yet that is what the disaster demanded. Not because the men lacked courage, but because the world around them had failed so completely that courage became the last available tool. Below the reactor, another fear took hold. Water had collected in areas beneath the destroyed core. There was concern that if molten nuclear material burned downward and reached large amounts of water, it could trigger a steam explosion. The exact scale of that potential threat has been debated, and some early fears may have been overstated. But at the time, the danger was taken seriously. Someone needed to drain the water. 3 men entered the flooded areas beneath the plant to open valves. Their names were Alexei Ananenko, Valery Bespalov, and Boris Baranov. For years, a popular version of the story claimed they went on a suicide mission and died soon afterward. That is not accurate. They survived the immediate mission, and the truth is more complicated, but the real story is still terrifying. They walked into a dark, flooded, contaminated part of the plant because someone had to. They moved through water with limited visibility, searching for valves in a place where the consequences of failure were impossible to ignore. Not a myth, not a movie scene. A real task carried out by real men in a ruined nuclear facility. That is the horror of Chernobyl again and again. Reality does not need exaggeration. The facts are heavy enough. In the weeks and months that followed, the exclusion zone took shape. Villages were emptied. Animals were killed to prevent the spread of contamination. Soil was scraped away and buried. Vehicles were abandoned in lots because they were too contaminated to use. Forests changed color in places under heavy radioactive fallout, including the area later known as the Red Forest. The world around the reactor became both ordinary and cursed. Trees still grew, birds still moved through branches, rain still fell, but everything had to be questioned. A shovel, a boot, a truck tire, a patch of moss, a glass of milk. The invisible enemy had entered the food chain, the land, and the memory of everyone who lived through it. Meanwhile, the first responders and plant workers, who had received the highest doses, were transported for specialized treatment. Many went to Moscow. Families waited for news. Wives, mothers, fathers, and children entered a different kind of nightmare. Hospital corridors, restricted rooms, doctors speaking carefully, bodies that had absorbed damage no love could undo. Some of the men who fought the first fires and worked in the first hours died from acute radiation sickness in the weeks after the disaster. Their deaths were not loud. They were not cinematic. They were human. And they remind us that the darkest moment of Chernobyl was not only what happened to the machine, it was what happened to the people who stood closest to it before the truth was fully admitted. The darkest moment was a city leaving under false reassurance. It was firefighters climbing into radiation without proper warning. It was operators trying to save a reactor that no longer existed. It was liquidators sent into poisoned spaces because the disaster had to be contained somehow. It was the ordinary people of Pripyat realizing, slowly, that home was becoming a memory, and it was the terrible understanding that the explosion had ended in seconds, but the consequences would continue for years, decades, and longer. By the time the buses left Pripyat, the story had already escaped the control room. It had escaped the plant. It had escaped the Soviet border. Radiation was moving through the atmosphere. Instruments far away would begin telling a truth that officials had not yet fully confessed. The world outside would start asking questions, and inside the Soviet Union, the machinery of secrecy would begin grinding against a disaster too large to hide. Because the reactor had spoken in fire, the city had answered with silence, and now the rest of the world was about to hear the echo. Not from a confession, not from a Soviet broadcast, not from the officials closest to the disaster walking before cameras and telling the world what had happened. The first clear signal came from far away. In Sweden, workers at a nuclear power plant detected unusual radiation. At first, they feared the problem might be at their own facility. That is the natural assumption. When alarm sounds, you look around your own house before you imagine a fire burning across the border. But the readings did not make sense. The contamination was not coming from inside their plant. It was on the workers' shoes. It was in the air. It had traveled there. A radioactive cloud had crossed countries quietly, without passports, without warning, without regard for secrecy or national pride. Instruments in Northern Europe began reading what Soviet officials had not yet fully told the public. Something had happened, something serious, something involving a nuclear reactor, and the silence around it started to crack. That is one of the coldest truths of Chernobyl. The outside world learned because radiation could not be censored. It could not be stopped at a checkpoint. It could not be ordered to remain quiet. It drifted with the wind, settled onto surfaces, and forced itself into measurement. Only then did the Soviet Union begin to acknowledge that an accident had occurred. Even then, the first statements were limited, careful, small. The language tried to shrink the disaster, but the scale could not stay small for long. Back near Chernobyl, the aftermath was not one event. It was a new reality. Pripyat had been emptied, but it was not dead in the way a battlefield is dead. It was stranger than that. The city remained standing almost exactly where it had been. Apartment buildings still rose over the streets. Curtains still hung in windows. Toys still waited in rooms. School books still sat on desks. Elevators stopped. Kitchens held the shape of interrupted lives. It was a city paused mid-breath. The people had been removed, but their absence became the loudest thing there. A chair pushed back from a table. A calendar on a wall. A coat left behind because someone believed they would return in 3 days. These objects became witnesses. They did not tell the whole story, but they held the shape of the lie. The promise that the evacuation was temporary. The hope that the roads would open again. The belief that a home can wait for you. But Pripyat would not wait in the normal way. It would change without people. Dust gathered. Windows broke. Rain entered buildings. Trees pushed into sidewalks. Animals moved through courtyards. Paint peeled from walls. The amusement park, which was supposed to open around the May Day celebrations, became one of the most recognizable symbols of the disaster. Its Ferris wheel stood above the empty city, like a monument to a future that had been cancelled before it began. But in the first weeks after the evacuation, there was little time for symbolism. There was work, endless work. The Soviet response became one of the largest cleanup operations in history. The word cleanup almost feels wrong, because it makes the task sound ordinary. You clean a kitchen. You clean a street after a parade. You clean mud from boots. Chernobyl was not dirty in an ordinary way. It was contaminated. The people sent to deal with it had to fight an enemy that could not be seen and could rarely be fully understood without instruments. Soldiers washed roads. Workers sprayed buildings. Crews removed topsoil. Forests were cut down. Machinery was buried. Villages were evacuated. Livestock was destroyed. Homes were marked. The map itself was redrawn into zones of danger. A person could stand in one place and be safe for a while. Then step a few yards away and enter a spot where radiation was far higher. The land had become uneven with invisible damage. This made every task heavier. You could not simply trust your eyes. A green field might be contaminated. A clean-looking truck might be dangerous to touch. Dust kicked up by a tire could matter. Food could matter. Rain could matter. Every ordinary act became suspicious. Eating, washing, breathing. The aftermath entered the body of daily life. For the evacuees, the disaster became personal in ways that numbers cannot capture. They were moved to temporary housing, relatives' homes, hotels, and later to new settlements. Some were relocated to a newly built city called Slavidik, designed to house workers and families after Pripyat was abandoned. But a new apartment does not erase the old one. A new street does not replace the one where a child learned to ride a bicycle. A new key does not unlock the door you left behind. Many evacuees had taken little with them. That was what they had been told to do. A few documents, some money, a little food, clothes for a short absence. They had left behind wedding albums, heirlooms, tools, school certificates, toys, letters, and the countless small things that carry a life's texture. Some tried to return later to retrieve belongings. Many items were too contaminated. Some were stolen. Some remained where they were until decay took them. In a disaster like this, loss is not only measured in deaths or radiation doses. It is also measured in the quiet destruction of continuity. People lost the physical proof of who they had been. They lost neighborhoods. They lost routines. They lost graves they could visit easily. They lost gardens, kitchens, balconies, bus stops, familiar trees, and the right to walk home without permission. For older villagers in the surrounding area, the displacement was especially painful. Many had lived through war, famine, occupation, and hardship before Chernobyl. Some had survived so much that being told to abandon their land felt like one more impossible demand from history. A number of people later returned illegally or semi-legally to villages inside the exclusion zone. They were often called self-settlers. Their decision was dangerous, but to them the danger of leaving forever was also real. Home is not always rational. Sometimes home is a field, a stove, a cemetery, a dirt road, a memory of parents, a place where every tree has a name even if no one wrote it down. For the first responders and workers who received high doses, The aftermath moved through hospital rooms. Some died within weeks. Others survived with lasting health problems. Families carried the trauma in private. The public language of heroism did not always make room for grief. A medal can honor a person, but it cannot return them. A ceremony can name courage, but it cannot undo the exposure that made courage necessary. The medical aftermath was complex. Acute radiation sickness affected those closest to the destroyed reactor. Broader public health effects, including thyroid cancers linked to radioactive iodine exposure, became major concerns in the years that followed, especially among children. Scientists and governments would argue over numbers, estimates, and long-term consequences. Some effects were clear, others were harder to measure. Radiation does not leave a simple signature on every life it touches. That uncertainty became part of the haunting. People wondered what had entered their bodies. Parents wondered what their children had breathed. Workers wondered how much time on a roof or road had cost them. Evacuees wondered whether the future had been changed in ways they could not see yet. And over all of it hung the knowledge that the disaster had not needed to unfold exactly as it did. The reactor had design flaws. The test had gone wrong. Warnings had been missed or ignored. The evacuation had been delayed. Information had been controlled. The aftermath was not just suffering after an accident. It was suffering sharpened by the feeling that human choices had made it worse. Meanwhile, the destroyed reactor still had to be sealed. A massive structure, often called the sarcophagus, was built around reactor number 4 in the months after the explosion. The name itself feels ancient and grim. A sarcophagus is something built for the dead, a stone container for what must not be touched. But this was not a pharaoh. It was a ruined reactor. Workers had to build in extreme conditions, near intense radiation, under pressure to contain the source before more contamination could spread. The structure was built quickly, because quickly was necessary. It enclosed much of the radioactive debris, but it was never a perfect solution. It was a desperate one, a tomb built around a machine. That image stayed with the world. Chernobyl became more than a place. It became a symbol of technological arrogance, state secrecy, human sacrifice, and invisible danger. It became the abandoned city in photographs, the warning sign, the gas mask on the classroom floor, the Ferris wheel against a gray sky. The name people use when they want to describe a mistake too large to contain. But for those who lived it, Chernobyl was not a symbol first. It was a phone call, a hospital visit, a bus ride, a locked apartment, a child asking when they could go home. A worker washing radioactive dust from a road he could never make truly clean. The aftermath spread across geography, medicine, politics, memory, and myth. Every layer revealed another kind of damage. The fire could be put out, the city could be evacuated, the reactor could be covered. But the questions remained. Who knew the reactor was dangerous? Who delayed the warning? Who chose secrecy over speed? Who was blamed and who was protected? And when a disaster is this large, can the truth ever be fully contained either? Because after the evacuation, after the hospitals, after the first official statements, Chernobyl entered its next and most human phase, the search for responsibility. And responsibility, inside a system built to hide weakness, would prove almost as dangerous as the radiation itself. And responsibility, inside a system built to hide weakness, would prove almost as dangerous as the radiation itself. Because after Chernobyl, the Soviet Union did what powerful systems often do after catastrophe. It searched for an explanation that could be contained. Not necessarily the whole truth, not necessarily the truth that reached into design bureaus, ministries, political culture, secrecy, and decades of institutional pressure. It searched for a version of the truth that could be named, judged, punished, and placed behind a door. A disaster this large creates a terrible need for clarity. People want to know who did it, who failed, who ignored the warning, who gave the order, who pressed the button. It is human to want a face on the nightmare. A name makes fear feel smaller. A trial makes chaos look like it can be organized. But Chernobyl was never that simple. The investigation began under the shadow of the state. The same state that had built the plant. The same state that had promoted the power of Soviet nuclear technology. The same state that had controlled the first information after the explosion. That does not mean every investigator was dishonest. Many people worked seriously to understand what happened. Scientists studied data. Engineers examined the reactor design. Officials gathered testimony. Reports were written. Timelines were built. The ruined plant became a crime scene, a technical puzzle, and a political wound all at once. But the truth had to pass through a system that feared embarrassment. And when truth passes through fear, it can come out bent. In the early official explanations, blame fell heavily on the operators. The story was shaped around human error, rule violations, and reckless behavior in the control room. The men on shift became the center of public responsibility. Anatoly Dyatlov, Alexander Akimov, Leonid Topchinov, and others were placed under the weight of the disaster in different ways. Some of those men were dead, some were dying, some were alive and facing punishment. The dead cannot defend themselves easily. The dying cannot explain history in a courtroom, and the living can be turned into containers for failures much larger than one shift. This is not to say the operators made no mistakes. They did. The test was badly handled. The reactor was placed in a dangerous condition. Safety systems were disabled. Procedures were violated or stretched. Decisions were made that helped create the final disaster. But the more disturbing question is why those decisions were possible. Why was the reactor capable of such a violent power surge? Why were the operators not clearly warned about the most dangerous characteristics of the design? Why did the emergency shutdown button have a hidden danger under certain conditions? Why had previous warnings about the RBMK design not led to open, urgent correction? Why did secrecy matter so much that even technical knowledge could be trapped inside restricted circles? These questions do not fit neatly inside one courtroom. They spread outward. They reach into the reactor itself. The RBMK design had strengths that made it attractive to the Soviet nuclear program. It was powerful. It could be built large. It could be refueled while operating. It served the goals of a state that needed electricity and wanted symbols of technological command. But it also had dangerous characteristics. Under some conditions, especially at low power, its behavior could become unstable. The positive void coefficient meant that as steam increased in the core, reactivity could increase too, and the control rods, because of their design, could briefly increase reactivity at the beginning of insertion under certain conditions. That detail is one of the most haunting in the entire investigation. The shutdown system itself could, in the wrong moment, make the situation worse before making it better. The stop button had a flaw, and the men in the control room were not fully prepared for what that flaw could do. After the disaster, changes were made to other RBMK reactors. Control rods were modified. Operating procedures were changed. Safety improvements were introduced. Those changes matter because they quietly admit something important. The problem was not only the men. The machine had been dangerous too. But admitting that in 1986 was not simple. The Soviet nuclear program was tied to national pride. To say the reactor design contributed to the catastrophe was to admit that the danger had been built into the system, not merely introduced by careless workers during one bad night. That kind of truth is radioactive in a political sense. It spreads blame. It touches people far from the control room. It reaches managers, designers, ministries, regulators, and the culture that shaped them all. So the official story narrowed. In 1987, several Chernobyl officials were put on trial. Among them were plant director Viktor Brykonov, chief engineer Nikolai Fomin, and deputy chief engineer Anatoly Dyatlov. They were convicted and sentenced to prison terms. The trial gave the state an answer it could display. There were guilty men. There were punishments. There was order again. But many questions remained. Some were technical. Some were moral. Some were almost impossible to separate from politics. How much did the designers know? How much did the operators know? How much information had been hidden from the people who needed it most? Could the evacuation have happened sooner? How many people were exposed because officials hesitated? How many lives were changed because the first instinct was not warning but control? The cover-up was not always one single secret locked in a drawer. It was a pattern, a habit of minimizing, a delay in speaking clearly, a refusal to tell local people the full danger when minutes and hours mattered, a public language that made catastrophe sound like a manageable incident. In the Soviet Union, information itself was treated like a material that had to be controlled, but Chernobyl proved that some truths escape. Radiation escaped first, then fear, then rumor, then foreign detection, then the questions. Across Europe, people wanted to know where the radioactive cloud had gone. Farmers worried about crops. Parents worried about milk. Governments measured food, rain, soil, and air. A disaster born in one reactor became a continental anxiety. Inside the Soviet Union, the emotional damage was harder to measure. Trust had been exposed. People realized that the state might not tell them the truth quickly, even when their bodies were at risk. That knowledge is corrosive. It does not disappear when the sirens stop. It enters conversations, kitchens, hospitals, and memories. Some historians have argued that Chernobyl helped weaken the Soviet system by revealing the danger of secrecy and the cost of lies. It was not the only reason the Soviet Union later collapsed. History is rarely that simple, but it became one of the moments when the official image of control cracked in front of the world. And behind that crack, people saw something frightening, a system that could build a nuclear giant, but struggled to admit when it had failed. A system that celebrated workers, then sent workers into danger without the truth they deserved. A system that promised a radiant future, then left a city empty under radioactive dust. The unanswered questions did not end with the trial. They continued in hospitals, laboratories, political debates, and family stories. How many deaths should be attributed to Chernobyl? That question remains difficult and controversial. The immediate deaths from the explosion and acute radiation sickness are known in a narrower sense, but the long-term health effects are much harder to count. Different organizations and researchers have produced different estimates. Some focus on confirmed cases and documented medical outcomes. Others estimate broader future impacts from radiation exposure across affected populations. The uncertainty itself became part of the wound. For people who lived through it, statistics could feel cold. A number on a page could not fully hold the fear of a mother wondering about her child's thyroid. It could not hold the memory of a firefighter leaving for work and never truly coming home. It could not hold the silence of an apartment building where every room had a story interrupted. Investigations can explain sequences. They can identify causes. They can recommend changes. But they cannot always answer the question that victims carry most heavily. Why were we not told? That question echoes through Chernobyl more than almost any other. Why were children outside the next morning? Why did people stand and watch the smoke? Why were families told the evacuation would be temporary? Why did the truth arrive in pieces? Why did instruments in other countries speak before officials spoke plainly? The horror of Chernobyl is not only that a reactor exploded. It is that truth had to fight its way through the same system that radiation had already escaped. And by the time fuller truth arrived, the damage had already entered the land, the bodies, the homes, and the future. The investigation named causes. The trials named guilty men. The reports named technical failures, but the deeper question remained like a shadow over the abandoned city. Was Chernobyl an accident? Yes, but it was also a warning about machines too powerful to be surrounded by secrecy, a warning about systems where obedience can silence doubt, a warning about pride becoming more important than safety, a warning about what happens when people trust institutions that are more afraid of embarrassment than disaster. And in the empty streets of Pripyat, those warnings did not need to be written down. They were already there. In the schoolrooms, in the hospital basement, in the amusement park, in the apartments where doors had been locked for a return that never came. The investigation tried to close the story, but Chernobyl would not stay closed, because some places become more than evidence. Some places become memory. And some memories keep glowing long after the fire is gone. And some memories keep glowing long after the fire is gone. Chernobyl did not end when the flames were extinguished. It did not end when Pripyat was evacuated. It did not end when the first sarcophagus was built over reactor number 4, or when the trials were finished, or when the official reports were printed and filed away. Disasters like Chernobyl do not end cleanly. They fade outward. They become zones on maps, warnings in textbooks, illnesses in medical records, arguments among scientists, nightmares in families, and photographs of places where no one lives anymore. They become a word, Chernobyl, a name that sounds like a place and a warning at the same time. For many people around the world, Chernobyl became the image of an abandoned city. The Ferris wheel, the cracked pavement, the trees growing through concrete, the empty apartment blocks with black windows, the classrooms with peeling paint and scattered books, the hospital where contaminated clothing was left behind, the swimming pool without swimmers, the streets where footsteps sound too loud, because a city built for thousands now listens to almost no one. But the legacy is not only the ruins. The ruins are what cameras can capture. The deeper legacy is harder to photograph. It is the loss of trust. It is the knowledge that a government can wait too long to tell the truth. It is the understanding that technology, no matter how advanced, is still built, managed, and explained by human beings. And human beings can be pressured. They can be afraid. They can be proud. They can be tired. They can be punished for honesty and rewarded for pretending everything is fine. Chernobyl forced the world to look at nuclear power differently. Not because nuclear energy is a monster by itself. The truth is more complicated than that. Nuclear power can provide enormous amounts of electricity, can operate without the same air pollution as fossil fuels. Many reactors around the world have operated safely for decades. But Chernobyl showed what happens when dangerous technology is placed inside a culture that hides flaws, discourages doubt, and treats bad news like betrayal. The reactor did not explode in a vacuum. It exploded inside a system, and that system mattered. After the disaster, changes were made. RBMK reactors were modified. Safety procedures were updated. The design problems that helped make the explosion possible were addressed in surviving reactors. The world studied Chernobyl because it had to. Engineers, governments, scientists, and safety agencies looked again at training, emergency response, communication, containment, and public warning. But no improvement could give Pripyat back its future. No design change could return those families to the exact lives they had before April 26, 1986. No report could unmake the bus ride out of the city. No monument could unlock the apartment doors and let time continue where it stopped. Today, the Chernobyl exclusion zone remains one of the strangest places on Earth. It is not lifeless. That surprises people. Wolves roam there. Birds nest there. Trees grow through streets. Plants reclaim buildings. Nature has moved into spaces that humans left behind. In some ways, the absence of people allowed wildlife to return. But that does not mean the land is healed in any simple way. Radiation still exists in the soil, in certain hotspots, in materials, in places where contamination settled heavily. The zone is not one uniform field of death. It is a patchwork. Some areas are less dangerous than people imagine. Some places remain highly contaminated. That unevenness is part of the unease. A place can look green and peaceful and still carry a hidden history under the leaves. A road can seem ordinary and still lead toward a structure built to hold back the remains of a disaster. A room can look abandoned, but not threatening, until you remember why everyone left. In 2016, a new confinement structure was moved over the old sarcophagus. It was enormous, shaped like a giant arch, designed to contain the ruined reactor and allow future work to dismantle unstable parts of the old shelter. It was a modern solution placed over an old nightmare, a second shell over the wound. A reminder that Chernobyl still requires attention, still requires money, still requires monitoring, still demands that people remember what is inside. That is another part of the legacy. The disaster created responsibilities that outlived the people who made the original decisions. Generations who were not in the control room, who were not alive when the explosion happened, still inherit the task of managing its remains. This is what long disasters do. They refuse to belong only to the past. For the people who lived in Pripyat, memory is not only historical, it is personal. Some returned years later, with guides or special permission, and walked through places that looked both familiar and ruined. They saw their old buildings, their schools, their courtyards, their stairwells. But home had become a museum without permission. A place where memory survived, but ordinary life did not. Imagine standing outside the building where you once lived, and knowing that your younger self still exists somewhere behind those walls. Not literally, but in the shape of a room, in the view from a window, in the path from the entrance to the bus stop, in the sound of neighbors who are no longer there. That is a quiet kind of haunting. No ghost has to appear. The absence is enough. And for those who lost loved ones, Chernobyl is not a symbol of abandoned buildings at all. It is a face, a name, a hospital visit, a funeral, a story told carefully because the pain is old but not gone. The firefighters who responded that night are remembered as men who faced danger they were not fully warned about. The plant workers who tried to understand and control the impossible are remembered with tragedy, argument, and sympathy. The liquidators are remembered for entering a poisoned landscape because someone had to stop the disaster from spreading further. Their legacy is complicated. It is heroic. It is sorrowful. It is also an indictment of the conditions that made their sacrifice necessary. That is why Chernobyl still feels frightening, not because it belongs to the supernatural, but because it belongs to us. It shows how ordinary rooms can become historic. A control room, an office, a hospital ward, a classroom, a bus. It shows how a disaster can begin in technical language, then end in human loss, a test, a power drop, a coefficient, a shutdown button, a delay, an evacuation, a lifetime. And it shows how the most terrifying forces are not always loud. Radiation is frightening because it can be invisible. Bureaucracy is frightening because it can make cruelty sound procedural. Denial is frightening because it can wear the face of calm authority. Everything is under control. Stay calm. This is temporary. You will return soon. Those words may have sounded comforting in the moment. Now they sound like the voice of a door closing. When people visit the exclusion zone today, they often describe the silence. But it is not a natural silence. It is not the peace of a forest trail or the quiet of a sleeping town. It is the silence of interruption. A city stopped before it finished becoming itself. A future abandoned in place. An amusement park that never became a memory for the children it was built for. Apartment buildings that still stand, not because they are alive, but because no one came back to wear them down in the ordinary way. There is something deeply unsettling about a place that was not destroyed, only emptied. A bomb leaves rubble. A fire leaves ash. Chernobyl left rooms. That is why the images remain so powerful. They show us a world that looks almost usable. A desk could be cleaned. A window could be repaired. A hallway could be swept. But beneath that almost is the truth. The city cannot simply go back. History has entered the walls, and so Chernobyl remains. A real place. A warning. A wound covered by steel and memory. The story began with a flash in the night, with men running through dust and steam, with firefighters climbing toward flames they did not understand. It moved through a city that woke up under a poisoned sky, through abuses that carried families away from home, through trials that answered some questions and left others in the dark. But the final image is quieter. Imagine Pripyat after everyone has gone. The buses have disappeared down the road. The apartments are locked. The playgrounds are empty. The power plant sits beyond the trees, damaged and burning. while invisible particles settle over a city that still looks as if its people might return by evening. A window is open somewhere. A curtain moves slightly in the air. On a kitchen table, something has been left behind because leaving was supposed to be temporary. Outside, the streets are still. Not peaceful. Still. And in that stillness, the truth of Chernobyl becomes clear. The scariest part was never that something impossible happened. The scariest part was that it was possible all along. A flawed machine. A pressured room. A culture of silence. A delayed warning. A city that trusted the people who told it to stay calm. That is all it took. No curse. No monster in the dark. Just human systems failing beside a power they could not afford to misunderstand. And long after the reactor stopped burning, long after the names were carved into memorials, long after the world learned to speak of exclusion zones and sarcophagi and radioactive clouds, Chernobyl kept asking the same question. What happens when the truth is more dangerous to a system than the disaster itself? In Pripyat, the answer is written without words. It is written in the empty schools, in the silent hospital, in the rusted Ferris wheel, in the roads leading nowhere ordinary, in the homes that still wait for people who were told they would be gone only a few days. And maybe that is why Chernobyl still haunts us, because it is not only a story about the night a reactor exploded. It is a story about the moment the future cracked open, and everyone nearby was asked to pretend they could not hear it. So, the city remains there, behind fences and warning signs, slowly being swallowed by forest, quiet, massive, waiting, not for the people to return, not really, but for the rest of us to remember what happened when the world was told the fire was under control, while the invisible poison was already moving through the dark. And maybe that is where we should leave Chernobyl, not with the explosion, not with the alarms, not with the courtroom, or the reports, or the numbers that people still argue about decades later, but with a city standing in silence. A city that was never meant to become a warning. Pripyat was built for families, for workers, for children riding bicycles under apartment windows, for school mornings, movie nights, summer evenings, and ordinary lives that were supposed to continue. It was not built to be photographed through broken glass. It was not built to be studied as a monument to failure. It was not built to become the place people point to when they want to explain how quickly the future can betray us. But that is what happened, and maybe that is why the story still stays with us, because Chernobyl does not feel like ancient history. It does not feel distant enough to be safe. It happened in the age of cameras, hospitals, power plants, official statements, and modern cities. It happened in a world that looked close enough to our own. People woke up, went to work, took care of their children, trusted their routines, and believed the systems around them would tell the truth when truth mattered most. Then one night, the sky flashed, and by morning, everything familiar had become dangerous. That is the kind of horror that does not need a monster. It only needs a locked door, a warning ignored, a machine misunderstood, a truth delayed until the damage is already done. So when we look at Chernobyl now, we are not just looking at a ruined reactor. We are looking at a question. How much danger can hide behind ordinary life? How long can people be told everything is fine before the truth becomes impossible to bury? And how many disasters begin, not with chaos, but with calm voices insisting there is nothing to fear? Out there, beyond the fences and warning signs, Pripyat is still standing. The forest keeps growing. The buildings keep aging. The Ferris wheel still waits in the open air. And somewhere in that silence, the past has not completely gone quiet. It is still there, in the empty windows, in the abandoned streets, in the rooms people left behind because they thought they were coming back. Chernobyl is not scary because it is impossible. It is scary because it was real. And because, for one terrible night in April, the future cracked open, not with a scream, but with a flash of light over a sleeping city. If you listened this far, thank you for staying with this story. History can be difficult to face, especially when it reminds us how fragile ordinary life really is. But stories like this deserve to be remembered carefully, not as myths, not as entertainment built from suffering, but as warnings left behind by real people who lived through something the world should never forget. So tonight, when the screen goes dark, remember Pripyat. Remember the workers. Remember the firefighters. Remember the families who locked their doors for a few days and lost a lifetime. And remember that sometimes the most haunted places on Earth are not haunted by ghosts. They are haunted by what people refuse to admit until it was too late.